Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Patrick.
Good morning. Good morning.
Hey, it is good to be together with you guys again, sort of together, sort of apart. But this is better than nothing. So we want to start out by talking a little bit about reopening, because I know that conversation has been had, and a lot of us pastors have been chatting back and forth. So I want to spend a little bit of time, kind of some of our thoughts.
Yeah, we hate this format.
And
by that, I mean, is that a strong word? We don't like when we can't be together. Maybe that's a better way of putting it. We don't like the ideas of people not being here, but given the necessity of our situation here in the Elmer community and wanting to be proactively careful, we believed it was the best approach that we could take. But we're also sensing that we are going to try to maneuver a little bit differently with how things are now trending in a good direction in our community, and we want to trend in a good direction as well.
Yeah. So we've also had the opportunity, and this past week we chatted with Jeff Urick, so we're really appreciative. He actually gave us a good half an hour where we chatted, shared some of our concerns, some of our worries, and so when we talk about some of our frustrations and stuff, we actually feel like the government has done a really good job.
Yeah.
I mean, for them to allow what they're allowing, and so now it's just a matter of us figuring out, okay, just because we can, should we? And when we do, what does that look like? So we've talked about a few different things. We've talked about, realistically, so we'll give you guys, we'll just be upfront. I don't think we're going to go to full in-person multiple services again until after Labor Day weekend. Some of that has to do with the timeline of the numbers in the Elmer community. Some of it has to do with just sheer, this is August. Attendance typically is already fairly low during August. You got a long weekend coming up. But then there's so many unknowns going into the fall because with school coming back, there's a lot of fear that COVID cases will rise. There's a lot of fear about what to expect. And so we don't really have anything solid in place. Loosely, we believe after Labor Day weekend, we are going to jump back in. The one thing we have been talking about, and so I'd be curious for you guys to give us some feedback on this. We do have the ability for you guys to come join us while we're recording this.
Yes.
And so if we wanted to do one service and put the 128 that we can fit in here, if people wanted to be here for this part, we can't sing, we have to wear masks. We've thought about that. Like when the outbreak first started, we just said no. Like we need, but right now most of our people, anybody who's had COVID has recovered. The people in isolation, for the most part that I know of, unless there's somebody that we're not aware of, has been done with isolation. And so if that's something people want, maybe if there's we didn't know how people would feel about it.
Yeah, we definitely want to also, along with that, make it very clear that we don't feel like in any way, in our discussions that we've had with both our members of parliament, whether federal or provincial, that we are being treated any differently than any other organization in terms of government approach. They have actually been very interested in hearing our questions and our concerns and proactively responding to some of that in a way that is very much on board with, yes, we need our churches and our communities to be actively engaging, and how can we make sure that we are continuing to do that. So from a very personal perspective, actually speaking to those people that represent us, we definitely feel like they are with us and that they are supporting what we do and the mission of the church, and we don't want anybody to feel like there are a different level of restrictions that we are being faced with that other. It's not. Actually, we actually feel like we have a little bit more liberty to meet in larger numbers than some places would have, given on the size and structure and how things work. So I think that's an important thing that we mention as well.
So that's where we're at with kind of reopening. I know that doesn't really answer questions, but know that we are in deep thought, and we have some ideas and some thoughts that we are going to be running by the rest of the elders, and slowly planting some seeds because we don't know when this is going to happen, that we can get together in such large numbers again. So we have some ideas.
I'm sorry, but I'm thinking, we talked about it. We're going to give you guys some answers or some ideas of what's going on. And then we have Q&A that's going to happen later.
Yeah.
It'll probably go pretty much the same way.
So we don't know. All right, so what we decided to do for the month of August, because we can't be together, and because COVID has really, Jen already prayed about this and talked about this, the whole anxiety piece. There's a lot of things people are terrified about. There's a lot of things people are scared of. But some of that has to do with the fact that there's conversations that we just haven't had to have that are now being forced, and we're struggling with that. And so what we've aimed to do during this series really is to kind of look, we're not going to do a massive teaching. We're not going to try to give you all the answers, but maybe just start a conversation about some of these conversations that we should be having that aren't. And so we started, week one, we talked about treasures. And COVID really, when everything kind of gets stripped away, it really reveals what matters to you.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely realized in my life that I really treasure my structure. I like my timetables, and I like how that works. Definitely something that I need to be a little bit more fluid with.
Yep.
But it's definitely something that I saw, and I was like, oh, okay, wow. I'm a little bit more rigid than what I thought I was, even though everybody around me would probably tell me that, no, you're like that.
Yeah, no, if you guys have met his oldest boy, you're like, oh, that apple didn't fall far from the tree.
And I keep wanting to say that's on Juanita, but it's really not. No, it's on me.
Right, and so some of that has been self-reflection, and some of it has just been a realization that the things that we were treasuring weren't actually things that we probably should have been treasuring.
Yeah.
Right now, as we're kept away, and you're hearing this from different, you have a funeral and you're capped. Man, that's hard. Well, what do you treasure? It's the people.
Yeah.
Your wedding and it's capped. You have Sunday morning services and you're capped. And there's all these things that I think, took for granted. And so I'm really hoping that when we do come through this, because I believe at some point we will, when we do, we don't lose those lessons. We don't lose the idea that there are certain things that we should be treasuring, and don't allow the distractions, the busyness, and whatever else to distract you from what really matters. And then week two, we kind of began to talk about the reality that, man, we're going to die.
Yeah, it's going to happen.
This is not a conversation most of us want to have on a daily basis, and we can't because it'd be too heavy. But the reality is we're going to, and that's part of what COVID has forced us to go with. Like, you can have a health system that's as great as you want, but in the end, something's going to take us.
I am by far a psychologist, or a psychiatrist. Maybe I need both. I don't know. But I would have to say, especially, like, I'm 45. And when people talk about midlife crisis, maybe I'm a little delayed. But definitely the idea that, I'm only 15 years away from 60.
Yeah.
And you start reading different statistics on different things of when people are more impacted by different health issues. And obviously, the older you get, the easier it is for you to be impacted. And you start thinking about that. I don't know if that's where midlife crisis comes from, the sudden realization that, whoa, you're not, impervious to this thing called death. Like, it's going to happen.
Yep.
And then all of a sudden you have to think about, well, wait, hold on. What's my life about? Like, and then you see people going off in all sorts of crazy directions to try to add purpose and meaning to their life, because they're like, well, what have I been doing? And I definitely think we've been able to have a little bit more of a conversation of, like, is my purpose and the plan for my life, is it what I want it to be? Is it something where when I get to that moment where, death is going to be, it's my moment, am I going to be okay with the situation, knowing that I poured into my life into the right things, and into things that have value and meaning, and I'm okay with that?
Yeah. Well, and the other thing it does, it brings about a lot of questions about a lot of unknowns.
Yeah.
Right? And I mean, when you start talking about death, you go, okay, well, what comes after death? But it starts with a question of, where did all this begin even?
Yeah.
Right? And I know Christians often, we talk about with a bit of confidence, we're like, and God created the earth. Where did God come from?
Yeah.
Right? And so whether you're an atheist, Buddhist, I don't care what you are, there's a lot of faith involved in the fact that we just don't know. If there's no God and there was just a big bang, you still have to explain how things began at some point. So it's somewhere something began. Mm-hmm. And so I know in our conversation we talk about, our belief in God and why we believe that there is this thing outside of us and this being, and a lot of it points back to when we really look at around us and we kind of go, something had to start somewhere. Yes, I struggle to understand where God came from. But I also struggle to understand where anything came from. Where did matter come from? Where did space come from? Like, something started something, and where, I don't know, right? But, when you begin to go, okay, well, if there's something bigger, which we believe it points to, then that gives us purpose here, but then also it informs what we believe will come after. And so much of that leads into the conversation today, and I think today is the conversation that I probably dreaded the most, but I think needs to happen the most. It's this conversation about judgment. And this idea that, okay, we're going to die, and we start talking about purpose, and you start talking about meaning. Scripture is full of this belief that there's going to be a judgment. And for a lot of us, I know in having conversations with my kids, and even when I reflect on my own life, you begin to go, well, who's in, who's out? Are my friends who don't believe going to hell? And those are hard, those are real, those are raw, those are difficult questions. But for every believer, this is a question you have to address. And I think COVID, if anything, has forced us to do some of this. And so that's kind of what we're wanting to address today, and we're going to try to do it with the most compassion and kindness that we can and care, because we believe this is a very sensitive, it is for me. It is a very sensitive topic because I have a ton of people that I absolutely love that wouldn't consider themselves Christians.
Yeah.
And so when I look at my faith and I look at what I believe, there's some difficult conversations. Like, I don't know how else to word that. It's just, it's challenging. So that's what kind of what I want to look at today. But what I want to start with is asking the question, so how does judgment fit into the Christian narrative? So we believe we have a worldview, we have a faith that is what we would call Christianity. So what does that look like? And how does judgment kind of fit into that in short?
Well, yeah, in short, we're running out of time already. The funny part about this, and this is, again, a rabbit trail and taking up more time when you say in short, but man, this has been a conversation that we've been having like all week long and really wrestling with a lot of these different topics and really kind of going back and forth to find the meaning that would be best to convey in a conversation. And, you know, one of the things that we talked about, the first thing you think about when Christians talk about, you know, judgment, the first thing that we jump into is like what everybody knows from the last 50, 60 years of the North American Christian experience, and that's turn or burn. Turn or burn. You think about the street preachers, you think about the old school pulpits and the hammering of the fists and the fingers pointing, and turn or burn. If you don't turn to God, you're going to burn. Let's explain that. The idea is that, you know, you have a responsibility to turn your life around by faith and put your eyes on Christ. And if you don't, you're going to burn in an eternity. And that's really been kind of like, in a general sense, the broadcast message. Yeah. When really, if we're going to look at the Christian message is that, you know, it's encapsulated very, very much in John 3:16. No matter, I mean, there's so much more to it than that. But if we're going to look at it very short, it's God loved the world. He provided an avenue for redemption and reconciliation through his son, Jesus Christ. If you're willing to choose that, then your life can have so much more meaning and so much more purpose and so much more, I get peace. There's so much more that's added to it, but it is a choice that everybody gets to make. And inside of that choice, like anything, there's still consequences to how we live out our life. And I don't think anybody would dispute the idea that there's consequences to all the choices that we make. I mean, especially as a young parent, one thing that I regularly do is I see those moments in my kids' eyes where I need to reflect, or I need to examine how I'm parenting, because all my action towards my kids has a consequence, and even life decisions. No one's going to dispute that if I'm driving 110 down Highway 45, that one day a consequence is not going to come to my life. You know, everybody says, yep, consequence. And it doesn't matter if I cry or if I say I need to use a washroom. It's not going to work for me. But there is a consequence to that. But the Christian message is basically God loves you. Yep. And he wants to have a relationship with you, and he wants to provide you with the meaning and purpose and plan for your life that you were created for, is what we believe.
Yep. Yeah, and so I think the one thing I want to make a tiny little side note, what we're not getting into today is the belief of exactly what heaven is, what hell is, all those things, because there's a huge spectrum. And that's not really our goal. Our goal is to really talk about the idea of being judged. And so if you have questions about that and you're like, well, I don't know if I believe in, well, that's not really what we're getting into. Maybe there's a time and a place. But really, you know what, you already started with this a little bit, but there is a deep sense of right and wrong that every person has. Now, we talk about judgment, and people would say, well, I don't like the idea that I'm going to be judged at the end of time. I don't believe in that. But what we would all agree on is the fact that every one of us has this really deep-rooted idea of what right and wrong is. Right? And it starts young, and so I've been laughing because Patrick's been telling me a story about his boys, and so his oldest boy is constantly defending the younger one whenever he's in trouble, because he doesn't believe that mom's and dad's version of right and wrong lines up with what he believes as a 5-year-old is actually supposed to be right and wrong. So I need to defend my brother. Right? And so you see that on a very, very young age. You see that throughout culture. We're seeing this right now in the States, in all these protests and riots. We're going to talk a bit more about that a bit later on what happens when you begin to distrust those who implement justice. But there's this piece of, this is wrong, and I need to make it right.
Yeah.
And the challenge is when our versions of right and wrong aren't the same.
Yeah.
right? But everyone has it. You had a story about a guy you worked with.
So I got to work with if you know the boxing world at all right now, the heavyweight champion of the world is a man by the name of Tyson Fury. And he is like your stereotypical, what you would think of as an English thug kind of looking guy. He is like 265 pounds. He is like 6'5", bald head. He is like that epitome of that. And the guy that I was talking to on the job site, that's what he looked like. It was hilarious. So sometimes stereotypes are true because there's usually truth in the stereotype. Anyway, just that needs to be said because it is true. So he was telling me he used to work in like the craziest maximum security prison in England. And this was the place where they held it wasn't like low-level drug offenders. This was the place where like the high-level diplomatic crazy people that were running like the cartels and that were doing the war crimes and that were doing all these crazy level of things would be housed. And he worked in that wing. And he would tell me that there was a few moments that he remembers that when there's something malfunctioned in the prison and someone from a different ward or a different wing made it onto the floor of where these guys were housed. And if that person happened to be like a child sex offender, they would not make it back to their cell alive. There was like a code amongst the criminals that said that even that line shouldn't be crossed. So even these guys, these guys were in for like unimaginable crimes. Mm-hmm. And yet that crime is not acceptable. And if that person ends up on here, they are not making it back. And it literally happened repeatedly. And that was their code. These criminals had a code. Yep. And there was lines that you did not cross, which is just unbelievable. They also had a line with how you treat women. Yep. There was a line. Yep. And it was unbelievable. And he was telling me the story. He was like, yeah, you would think that these guys didn't, but no, they actually had a line.
And you see that everywhere. You see that in every culture. You see that there's a line drawn. And those lines don't always agree, but where does that come from? Yeah. What is that within us that has this deep, because really, when we've talked about this often, but if you to be a true evolutionist, we want the strongest to survive.
Right.
But we can't live like that.
No.
I don't know any atheist that's like, I want just the strong to survive. No, we fight tooth and nail for everyone to have a shot at life.
Yeah, there'd be no cancer treatment. There'd be no help for the person.
No.
You wouldn't bother helping the woman who can't have labor normally. You wouldn't. There'd be none of that because only the strongest.
Because the core belief is you need the strong people to survive so we can have a strong human race. But there's something inside of us that just goes, that's wrong.
Yeah.
And for us, so much of it then points, and what we would take that as we're kind of designed that way. And the whole idea is that you have this compass that kind of leads you in a place where you treat people well, because everyone can live well if everyone treats others well.
Right.
Right? Like you can't have it any other way, right? International Justice Mission is such a phenomenal organization, but they talk about unless you bring justice into an area, you can never actually live well, because if violence and crime run rampant, you can't find good life. You can't find true life, right? You need this idea of justice. And so for us, we would point to the idea that it's God, the way he's designed us. And so as we get further into this conversation, one of the things that we did want to stop and talk about is something that really angers me, at least, is cold-hearted Christians. Cold-hearted. Yeah. And what I mean by that is when we've had this conversation so often, we end up having it in such a harsh, cold, demeaning way. You all are going to hell. Yeah. They're all going to hell. And we say it with such a, like, if you really believe this, like if you're on the extreme end, you really believe everybody that does not say this one little prayer is going to hell, your life should be like this urgent 24/7 push to get everyone to say that. But sometimes when we say this message, it comes across so cold. And so, I don't care. I'm going to heaven. I don't care. You deserve hell. And I think that really misses the mark of Christianity, because everything about Christianity is about being led by love. And everything about Christianity is about caring deeply. Like Jesus, that's what I love so much about Jesus. His teaching is phenomenal, but what I love seeing is the way he treated people. And then he keeps saying, what you see me do, you see God do. Yeah. He loved the people who were, he'd meet in this one case, the adulterous woman gets thrown in front of him. What does he do? He has compassion on her. He loves her. Mm-hmm.
And he
Right.
definitely says, go and sin no more. There's no question about
Sure.
that. Nobody denies that. But how he treated that individual, I mean, I think that's something, I know there's different spectrums to this conversation, and we try to address that a little bit without getting into the deep-seated theology of it. And there's no question that Jesus talked a lot about hell. There's no question about that. He taught a lot on the subject. That is true. But how did he live?
Yep.
How did he spend every waking moment of his ministry life? It was caring and showing compassion and love towards people. His everyday 24/7 was incredibly led by love so that he could actually have their ear to instruct or teach about the greater things of the kingdom, of God, of heaven and hell, of responsibility. But, we focus on this, he taught so much on hell, we need to teach on hell. That's the way people, and really, and then we convince ourselves that if I just tell somebody, hey, if you don't say this sinner's prayer, you're going to go to hell, then I have done my responsibility, and I can now detach myself from having to have relationship with that person, and I can detach myself from actually having to love that individual, which I am commanded to do, because I showed love by telling them that if they don't turn, they're going to burn.
Now, a cool way we've seen this play out is when we went to Belize. So, when we were down there, one of the things they let us do is they let us go visit Belize Central Prison. And in prison ministry, this is exactly what we're talking about here. Like, this is where the rubber meets the road. How do you treat people like this? You just go, well, these hardened criminals, they should all just burn in hell. Sadly, that's what a lot of Christians kind of push. That's what their lives push. They may not say they push that, but that's really what their lives push, right? But we were really impacted there because in this prison, and if you guys haven't seen it, if you guys look at World's Worst Prisons on Netflix, they actually do a full episode on this prison and the impact of what it would actually look to lead by love. There's still consequences. There's still justice that needs to be done, but these guys led by love, and it really, really, it impacted both of us, and it was definitely impacting them. So I know one of the guys really impacted you, so why don't you share that story?
Yeah, so we're down in Belize, and it kind of started with there was a gentleman that was at BCE who was once an inmate at the prison, and he talked about the transformation that he witnessed there. And if you understand the prison before and after, the gentleman that gave us a tour of the prison, his name was Francis, but his father was asked to take over the prison, and he decided to change how the prison was run. So before he came in, literally, there was no open space for these guys to be able to move. Everything was where they took the bucket that was in their 4x8 cell, and their bucket was their toilet, and they would take that bucket out, and they would just dump it out on the grounds, and there was maybe a small little area for them to stand that wasn't basically like a cesspool of waste. Yeah. And when he came in, the first thing he did was bring in truckloads of dirt to change that. And he actually created a space for them. And then he continued with this narrative that he was going to treat these individuals that were in prison with a respect and a love that meant that their lives could have purpose again. So while we were there, Francis gave us a tour of this prison, and I'll never forget it. He took us into the youth area and also the educational and reform area of the prison. And I mean, it is a prison. It's like stepping back in time. There is the guard towers and what you see in the movies, and these guys climb up into these guard towers with the little tiny roofs over top, and they're up there with their big M16 machine guns, and I mean, it is a prison. There's the barbed wire, tall fences. You see all that. There's still consequences to what has happened, but instead of these guys being treated like animals, they're treated with dignity and humanity. Yep. So we're in here, and they're showing us, and we enter into like this small room. It's probably a 25 by 25 foot square room, and all around the outside and in the inside are computer labs. And they're all the juveniles that are going through their education process, because they want to make sure that by the time that they're done their sentence, that they have been fully educated so that when they leave the prison, they can actually get a job in society. So not only do they get book smart, but they teach them how to farm, they teach them how to do plumbing, they teach them how to do electrical. But here we are in this room, and then they ask all the kids to stand up, and he says, what you don't know is that in this room right now is the second highest scoring youth in all of Belize in terms of the education testing that we have. And they called out his name, and he happened to be standing right next to me. And he said he is in here serving a sentence for murder. But he is now the second highest scoring individual. And then a little bit of his backstory. When you start understanding, you get informed about a person's life, being birthed into a fatherless home in poverty, gang-infested poverty, where, you don't know where your next meal's coming from other than the dumpster. I mean, this is an area of Belize where you grow up, and in order to have hydro, you are taking a wire and you're running it and you're tapping it into the actual electrical grid so that you guys can have some sort of hydro in your home. It is a place where if you don't have protection, then your life is at risk. Yeah. And if he doesn't decide at a young age to join into a gang and then through that gang be protected and have some semblance of family structure, and then understanding that, maybe he was like asked to do a job, to run some drugs, to be a mule. Maybe he, in a situation got caught, and he had to decide it was my life or his. And when you understand that he was trying to like help his family and like salvage his life somehow, when that informs you a little bit, it doesn't change the fact that there's a consequence for the action he did. But man, it sure changes how you judge that individual, knowing the type of individual he was standing next to him, and how his shoulders were back, his chin was up, and he actually could see that his life could have meaning and purpose once he's done his judgment, so to speak. And that really changed my view, to understand that there's a lot of stories that I don't know. If I just read the headline that says, individual sentenced to murder for killing, I'm like, yeah, he deserved it. But if I understand a little bit more about his struggle for life and his struggle for survival, his struggle to take care of his kids, his brothers, his sisters, his mom, his struggle to not see her get beat, like all those it really changes how you're informed about that judgment. Yeah. It really impacted my life that way. I think sometimes we're so cold because we don't see how much of a struggle other people have.
Well, and that's something that, over the years, working in the job we do, and having some of the family experiences we've had, seeing the impact of a healthy family on an we both grew up in families. We're lucky. Our parents are together. They love us. We get along with our in-laws. We get along we have it well. And then you begin to hear stories of people who they watched their dad beat their mom, or they had parents both addicted to drugs, and they grew up in a world that was so broken. But then you hold these kids to the same standard. And these kids who grew up with a perfect, and we know from psychology, we know the impact of those first couple of years on kids. We know the impact of a healthy family relational structure on kids. We know this. And so when we remove ourselves from a position of love to a position of judge, which a lot of us Christians do, and this is where this cold-heartedness comes from, is I know you're going to hell because you did A, B, C, and D. You know nothing. Right? You know nothing about why they became that person. You know nothing about why they made that decision. And then the more you allow yourself to get into that place where you actually hear stories, the more compassionate and loving you are. Right? When you've had a kid, and I've had a couple kids, and they're not born criminals. They're not born terrible human beings. They're born innocent. And so as kids grow up, it depends on what some of it, they make their own choices, and there's consequences, all that stuff, but people have stories. What people want is they want to be loved. What people are hoping for is a future that's bright. And so I think that kindness needs to come into this conversation. And that leads us into what we really think is the core crux of this conversation. And that is the question on, do we trust the judge?
Yeah. I think at the end of the day, when we peel back all the layers that are very human for us to have, and all of our anxieties and fears and worries and how we struggle for this idea of justice inside of judgment, at the end of the day, it does come down to whether or not I believe that the judge is going to rightly, adjudicate, or he's going to rightly decide what was right and what was wrong, and I can trust him with that. Yeah. Believing that there's no question that when I stand before the judge, I want him to be compassionate, fair. I want him to know everything. I want him to know the sorrows and hurts and struggles I had before I made the wrong choice that I made, so that he actually can really understand, the motive to it, instead of it just being a cold, cutting judgment. And I think in terms of trusting the judge, it really does come down to, can we trust God to rightly rightly judge our lives and rightly judge the ones around us.
Now, some people would go on, okay, well, that's oversimplifying. There's more to it. You have to, but no, at the end of the day, everything is based on trust. We're seeing this in the U.S. What happens when you stop trusting the people enforcing the justice system? Then you rebel against, right? I agree. In Mexico, my homeland, right? It's my affection for tacos, right? I was only there a couple of years, but we went back and visited a lot. In the policing system there, the federal system, for the most part, I believe, is rid of corruption. They've worked very hard. But a lot of the locals, and everyone knew it, just bribe them. Just bribe them. And so then you begin to look at justice with a skewed view that if somebody's in prison, you're not even sure they belong in there.
Yeah.
Right? Is justice actually justice? Because really, when we talked about this, most people have, when you know this line that we were talking about before, we all have a list of people we would think deserved hell.
Oh, yeah.
Whether you believe in hell or not, there's a list of people you go, well, if there is a hell, I hope they get it.
There's a special place for that person in hell.
Right.
Right?
That's one of those sayings that we have, because we really, we have this line of who we think should go. So it's not a question of whether we think judgment is a good idea. All of us do, especially those who are impoverished, especially those who are on the lower end of it, go, somebody's got to make this right at some point. So it's not a question of that. It's a question of, is the justice fair?
Right.
Is the judgment right? And so for us, one of the hardest questions I think I've ever been asked, or continue to get asked, when you end up doing a funeral, or somebody's on, where they're about to pass away, and people go, well, what if they don't? Do you think they're going to go to heaven, Albert? Or what do you think is going to happen? Right? And it's so tough because you're dealing with such a raw, real, difficult question. And I remember the first time I had to do a funeral for a family that I didn't know for sure. They didn't know for sure. And I really believe the Holy Spirit gave me a lot of peace about this, and he just said, but you do know the judge. And when I can get to a place where I know that the judge is fair, then if anybody goes to hell, because let's be very clear, I want to be very honest about my personal opinion here. I hope everyone makes it to heaven. Like, this is the way I live my life. It's the way I honestly, I have no desire for anyone to go to hell. For whatever hell is, I have no desire for anyone to be there. I would be more than okay to wake up one day and realize everyone's in heaven. And I know not everybody agrees with me, but that's the way I feel when I look at people, when I look at stories, when I look at why people end up the way they end up in eternity. I hope everyone's in heaven. Like, that's my predisposition. But I trust that whatever God is going to do is going to be fair. And that makes such a big difference. And if you think about it here, if Patrick ends up getting put in prison for doing his 110 in a 40 zone or whatever you were saying that you do.
Not in a 40, come on,
That's an 80
man.
zone, all right. So whatever, you're doing 110. Like, if you get a ticket,
Yeah.
and it's a fair ticket,
Yep.
and I end up going in front of the same judge,
Yep.
I may be nervous that I'm going to get nailed for consequences, but I'm not going to be afraid that they're going to mess me over or be completely unfair.
Right.
Right? I'm just going to own what I had to do.
Yeah.
And I think when we can get to a place with God where it's the same thing, then these questions aren't quite so challenging anymore. You kind of go, okay, I saw the way Jesus treated people outside of faith.
Yeah.
Actually, when we talked about this whole conversation about hell and who Jesus was the hardest on, it was always the religious people.
Yeah, it's
people
very
who
interesting.
should know better. You should know better. Stop treating people like this. Right? And so I think so much of this conversation goes back to judgment. I think all of us can kind of agree on. That it's going to happen in some form. The question is, do I trust God? And really, that becomes everything in this conversation. Because if I don't trust God, then his decisions are not worth trusting. But if I can get to a place where I can go, okay, God, I trust you. But that changes today. And that changes tomorrow. Because if I can trust God with my eternity, and I believe he's fair, then that changes the way I live today. But it's not a fear thing. And this is what I think bothers us so much with this turn or burn.
Yeah.
Jesus never feared people into hell or into heaven. He never tried to convince people that if I scare you enough, you'll follow me. Because he believed love changed. He believed that if I love people authentically and if I pay for their sins, they will experience that love, and that love is what drives change.
Yeah.
That's why God is defined as love. Right? John says that in 1 John. He says, God is love. Let's try to describe God. Well, love.
Yeah.
Love is what God is.
Yeah.
Right? And so that love then works backwards into the way he judges each of our days and the way then we are to treat others.
Yeah, there's definitely no way we can get around. I mean, like you're saying about John, where, it's impossible for you to say, I love God and hate my neighbor. it just, you can't.
No.
It just doesn't work that way. He's saying if you love God, then you will love your neighbor. You will love that person next to you, because that's what having a relationship with God will do to your life. You will love them. And
I think what happens, though, is that it's easier to condemn and walk away than it is to love and continually be hurt.
yeah, when you can say, hey, I did my part by showing them love, by saying you need to turn or burn, and then just detach myself, and then I convince myself that that was my part. I think that really that's not the life that Jesus led. You can clearly see that's not the way he treated people. He was engaged entirely in their lives.
Even though he knew in the end they would turn on him.
Yeah.
And that moment with Judas, I think, that moment blows me away the more I think about it. He knew Judas was going to betray him. He knew he was going to be incredibly hurt by Judas. And what does he do? He loves him.
Yeah.
Washes his feet, has dinner together.
Yeah.
Like, this is the last memory that Judas is really going to have of him before he fully betrays him.
Yeah, calls
Like,
him
that's
friend
crazy.
on
That's
his
crazy.
betrayal night. Friend.
As he's sitting on the cross.
I don't know. That's not the name I probably would have used. Like, he
Right, even as he's sitting on the cross, and he's looking at these people who have chanted, crucify him, and he's looking at these people, some of them he may have healed, some of them he may have, brought a relative back from the dead. Some of these might be Lazarus' family.
Yeah.
He's looking at all these people, and he goes, Father, forgive them. That's the heart is towards other people. That's how we should feel towards other people. Instead of being at this place where we just condemn and say, well, you're going to hell. Well, no, let's just show what love is. And so I really think, so at the end of this, I don't know if you guys have any questions have come through, but I know we have not fully covered this. But we do want to jump into part 2 of this, which is the end times. So Patrick, if you want to make your end times joke.
Yeah, I had an end times joke here. We're going to talk about the end times at the end of our time.
See what we did there?
Yeah,
See what we did there?
See what I did there.
And it's going to come quickly.
I've been using this joke over and over again this week. Yeah, even so, Lord, come quickly.
I know,
Yeah.
it's lame.
Yeah.
But the end times, this kind of goes together. Every time we go through anything. Are you guys, is the joke that
Trevor's
bad?
chirping my joke. He's like, that is like the worst joke. Eat another donut, buddy. I got you a whole bunch. Yeah.
So end times and the whole idea of end times is often, this is a big topic in Christian circles.
Especially around judgment. I mean, when we're talking judgment, justice, end times, they just all of a sudden, that's where we go. And I mean, you can find endless resources of endless amount of teachers and people that will take you step by step through, the book of Revelation and, Jonah and Isaiah and just tie it all together. And it's amazing theology and it's really incredible. And it really is informative in terms about some of the things that are going to happen. But at the end of the day, if your understanding of everything that's going to happen doesn't inform your living today, then you really didn't have much purpose to why you learned what you learned. And what our conversation has been on is that it's good to be informed and to be instructed and to learn these things. But when we talk about end times, it really should impact what we do in our community. It should really change how we see our current living. It shouldn't, we talked about this idea that, hey, we're living in the end times and, it's time to, it's okay for me to pull back and, because Jesus is coming. And really, if you understand that the times are near, it should actually be the opposite of that, where you're even more going out and you're even more desiring to share, the love of Christ with individuals.
So if we can backtrack a little bit, one of the things that we believe as a Christian faith community is that at some point Jesus is coming back.
Yes, we do believe that.
So when we talk about end times, this isn't something that, some people believe, some people don't. At some point, we believe this is going to end.
Yeah.
At some point, Jesus is going to return. What that's going to look like, there have been different movies made, and nobody really knows. Lots of opinions, lots of interesting conversations. Like, I think some of this, what happened before the earth and what's going to happen after, some great conversation.
Yes.
Some really interesting theories. But in the end, we don't know.
No, we don't.
But what we do conclude and believe fully in is that there is going to be an end of times, and there's scriptures that point to, depending on how you read them, they definitely point to that there's certain things that are going to happen around the end of times.
Right.
Right, and so that's where we begin to get this debate. Now, so it's interesting. So right now, if you're familiar with some of the passages, it talks about rumors of wars and battles and illnesses and a lot of the things that are happening now. And people are going, well, these verses all line up. So
Yeah.
clearly Jesus must be coming soon. But then what's interesting, and I think we have to factor in, so Patrick was sharing a message with me this week from a guy named Jonathan Edwards, and I think he's early 1900s. I might be off.
He was like a couple centuries back, but people have been taking that message and then re-preaching it. So this was a guy, from 25, 30 years ago, re-preaching this message from 250 years ago. And
So he was telling his people that based on his study of Scripture and what was going on in the world, clearly Jesus was coming soon.
Right.
And if you go back a couple hundred years before that, you find those messages. And a couple hundred years before that, the disciples, actually, the very early disciples of Jesus, did not believe they would die. They thought Jesus would come before that.
Yeah, literally within the first 100 years of what we would say was the New Testament church, if we're going to use those terminologies, they believed that he would return. And that has not stopped. There has always been someone saying, yes, I know the times are coming. It's coming, it's coming, it's coming. People are always, and we're not trying to take away from the reality that we are taught in scriptures that we are to watch, that we are to be attentive to, that we're to pay attention to that. We're not saying that you're not supposed to at all. We're just saying it's been 2,000 years of people saying, hey, it's going to happen real soon. And the reality is that should be enough evidence for you to realize that these theologians and these people who have spent like their entirety of their life to understand these scriptures don't know. No. And I mean, that does line up with what Jesus said when he said,
you won't know.
Yeah, you don't know. Like, I always come back to this. I have numerous people that message me saying, well, what about this? What about that? That means it's the Mayan calendar and all this kind of stuff. And we could talk about all these other things. And it comes back to Jesus literally said, only the Father knows that. Yeah. Only the Father. Yeah. And we have to remember those words. Yeah. That helps us. What should it do? It should be something that says, hey, wake up. Yeah. Wake up. Pay attention. And live out what you believe. Because it could be another 1,000 years, or it could be tomorrow.
Well, and I think the flip side of this, and we need to start wrapping up here and getting some questions, hopefully. Christians have such a fatalist view of the future. Like, it's never like the conspiracies coming out of the Christian circle is that Canada is going to be better in 100 years. It's always that the government's they're gonna persecute us, and this is gonna happen, and that's gonna happen. Why are we so dark about the future? We're the ones who are supposed to have hope, faith, hope, and love. That's supposed to be like our theme song. This is what we're singing everywhere. I got faith, I got hope, and I'm loving it. Right? Like that should, but we're so fatalistic. Oh, the world's gonna end, and China's gonna take over, or Russia's gonna take over, whatever conspiracy you want to go with.
That's next week, by the way.
When you look at what's happening in China, the church is exploding.
Yeah.
It is exploding because people are desperate for hope. When you look at a lot of these communist nations or a lot of these third world nations, the gospel is exploding in these places. But we, for some reason, all we can ever see is the darkness. And I think, again, this points back to trust. Yeah. Do you trust God? Because really what we're scared of is that our incredible way of living is going to be stripped away. That's what we're scared of.
Yeah.
Right? And then we're trying to kind of use scripture to back this up. But really, what we should worry about is the marriages in our neighborhood. Are you pouring into your neighbors? Are you pouring into your friends? Are you pouring into your marriage? Are you pouring into your kids? Are you a part of the solution? Like, going back to this police prison, you can correct me if I'm wrong in this, but my recollection of this is that they lost money on this prison every year because the government did not have enough money to actually do this. And so what they would do is they funded this prison with their own private construction business. Yeah. They would make up the difference because they believed strongly enough in this. Yeah. If we believe so strongly that we are a part of making the world better, let's sacrifice to make the world better. Yeah. Be a part of it, right? And so we as a church, we've got a cool couple things that we've been doing with that. And that Family Central Apartments is a big part of that. But a lot of you guys are investing, whether that's here in the church, whether that's in different community things. But we need to get away from this fatalist thing that everything's going to suck at some point. We need to work towards believing that we can make Canada better for our kids. Yeah. We can make this nation safer for our kids. We can make this nation healthier for our kids. And we need to be a part of that. Because God's intent for the world was to find life. Yeah. And I think sometimes when we begin to talk about judgment and end times, we lose track of all that kind of stuff. And so kind of if I wrap it up here a little bit, when I think about judgment, when I think about end times, when I think about this stuff, I think about hope. Yeah. Hope Because fear has been a big part of my life as a kid. And sadly, I've passed that gene on to my own kids. But hope that at some point I'll be able to live in a place without fear. At some point, I'll be able to go to sleep without being worried. At some point, death is done. At some point, violence is done. At some point, things will be made right. And that really is the hope of eternity, and that is the hope of heaven, and that is the hope of God working in our lives. And so for us as Christians, we need to begin to live with a lot more hope that, yes, we may be suffering now. Yes, we may, but there is hope. And we want to share that hope, and we want to live in that hope. That this suffering is not eternal. This suffering is but a few years, a blip in the radar of eternity. And so there's hope. And so for all of you guys out there that are struggling with fear the way some of us do, you are struggling with anxiety, that are struggling with physical ailments, the message of the gospel says there's hope. For those around the world who are struggling with being slaves, who are struggling with these oppressive regimes, it's not an excuse for us not to do anything. We want to be as active as we humanly can.
Yeah.
But we can also share the message that because we won't be able to solve everything in our lives, we won't be able to make everything right. But you got to understand at some point it will be made right.
Yep.
And that needs to inspire us and give us hope. And so we want to be a part of bringing the kingdom here to our lives now and making things right to the best of our ability now, but acknowledge that God will make it right.
Yeah.
And that's good news. That is great news.
It is great news. It's the great news of the gospel message. And it's the message that we want to share with every person that we come in contact with as God leads us to tell people, not only through our actions of love, but also through our words, and to encourage people. Like, there might be someone right now who's listening at home who's never received that new life in Christ. And I mean, we want to convey to them, if you haven't, then now would be a terrific opportunity for you to, like where you're at home right now, to just bow your head and say, God, I believe, help me to have this life that you offer. I want this life that you offer. There's so many different ways that we can talk about asking, Jesus into our hearts, or saying, God, I give you my life. I've heard it put in so many different ways. And if you want this life, it's just as simple as bowing your head and just receiving God. And then engaging in community and learning and letting God lead you, and learning what it means to be led by love, and learning what it means to listen to him as he wants to, inform your life. And that is something that we want for every person out there. Yeah. So if you've never accepted Christ, now would be a terrific time for you to do that.
And if that's something that you are interested in or are doing, we'd love to know about it.
Yeah.
Not so we can tell the world, but literally so that we can pray alongside you, because it's like anything else. Like, getting married is easy.
Yep.
You walk up in front, you say a few I do's, but that really just is the start of a journey, of a relationship. And it's so much like that with faith, that, this beginning point, it's a highlight.
Yeah.
Experiencing God's grace for the first time and understanding everything is forgiven, everything is right, like, that's unreal. Mm-hmm. But it's just the beginning. It's just the beginning of a journey. And so we would invite you guys in on that journey. All right, we got a couple minutes left. Any questions come in? I see some comments have come through. If there's no questions, we'll kind of wrap up.
Yeah.
Just comments?
I think they
Are we nailing everything?
I think they were anticipating the same type of answers that we were telling
We've
them.
already let them down so much.
They're
they're not going to answer them.
No.
So throughout the week, if you guys want to send us a message on any of this stuff, like we say, we're pretty humble about a lot of this stuff, in the sense that we understand what we understand, and we understand that we don't understand a lot. And there's a lot that God says you're just going to have to trust. And so we believe that the core of this is trust. What we want to do at the end here, next week.
Next week.
Yes. So we want to address something that we have to address, even though I'm terrified to even say that I'm going to address it, but we need to address conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
Not because this is something new with COVID, but because this is something that we just tend to enjoy. And it's not just conspiracy theories, it's gossip in general.
Oh, man.
Don't we love gossip?
Oh.
Well, what is that inside of us? Why do we love those stories?
It's a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Dude, when the Astros cheating scandal first came out, gotta love talking about this, right? Like, it's crazy. So what is it about conspiracy theories? So send us your best ones that you have, that you've heard of. We've got cell towers, vaccines, Bill Gates.
Elon Musk. Yeah. We got all sorts of
vaccines. We got all sorts of doozies already.
Computer chips.
Now, this isn't going to be a scientific debate, because we're not that smart.
No.
But we're going to have this conversation about why we're so drawn to these things.
Yeah.
And maybe some ways of balancing the challenge in our head not to let these things overtake.
Yeah.
And how do we go in moments when we are unsure? But anyways, that's next week.
Yeah. Well, when it seems like when it hits the fan,
Yes.
conspiracy theories seem to it's like injecting steroid. All of a sudden it becomes something that just amplifies even more and more and more.
And it happened after 9/11. It's happened
yeah.
after everything, right? So with that, we're going to wrap up the service part. And then if you guys have not seen the Psalm series, we're going to do the third of this Psalms small group videos that we created. And we didn't even mean to do this, but man, did it work out well. It's on undeserved suffering and having a conversation with God about the reality that some of the things that you're going through right now are just undeserved.
So we do have a question that's come in hot off the presses.
So once we're done this question, if you guys have not seen it, we're going to jump straight into the Psalms thing. It's about 14 minutes. I'd love for you guys to watch it. But what do we got?
Okay, it says, I definitely identify with Albert's disposition that everyone should go to heaven, but I've come across a lot of people who can't get past being their own judges and thinking that God's way of loving is unfair, that someone who has taken a life could be in the same kingdom as them. God's infinite love stopping them from infinite love. Where do you guys think that comes from?
Great question.
Yeah.
So can we just say I don't know? No, just kidding.
No.
You know what? What really has helped me with this is the imagery of baptism. Now, to become a Christian, Jesus didn't leave us a whole lot. Like, he didn't say sing 3 songs. He didn't say any of this. He left us with, no, he didn't. You can sing as many songs, as little songs. You can be hip-hop. You can be country even. He didn't even say country wasn't allowed in the church. But regardless, so Jesus left us with very few things, and one of them was baptism. And baptism was to symbolize what it meant to join the kingdom. And so in baptism, you acknowledge that you cannot enter on your own. And so you go into the water.
Yeah.
And you will basically, it's a death to your old self, and then Christ brings you up.
Right.
Now, what's interesting about this is that the murderer and me enter the same way.
Yeah.
And what ends up happening with this conversation is that people get to a place where they believe they've somehow been good enough to actually earn this, and others are bad enough that they shouldn't. When the reality is, none of us are good enough. And when you can continually remind yourself that you're just not that good, like you are not good enough to make it. And if none of us are good enough to make it, then who am I to say, well, you're too bad?
Yeah.
And I think that's where we really have to come back to understanding what it means to be in and out. What it means to be in is to confess that you are a sinner and you accept the grace of God. But then we're all the same.
Yeah.
Whoever is asking the question doesn't deserve it any more than the person they're talking about, than the person they're talking about. So does that mean even Hitler? Yes, even Hitler.
Yeah.
Do I think this is fully fair? No. But what does that go back to? Do I trust the judge? Yeah. But again, do you want God to be fair? I don't. If I want God to just be fair, then I'm going to hell. Because I'm just not that perfect of a person. Yeah. There are a lot of sins that I've committed knowing, even as a pastor, there are things that I've done knowing it's a sin. I've done it anyway. So if we want to just talk about fairness, where the bar has been set, I'm going to hell, so are you.
Yeah.
What we want is grace. And I think that's that thing that we keep going back to, going, the grace God gives us is so undeserved. Yeah. So what we're going to go do is also give other people that same grace. Yeah. And is that a bit hard? Absolutely. Is this an easy thing? No. But that is the beauty of the gospel, is that God so loved the world.
Yeah, and I think one of the difficult things is to go along exactly with what you're saying, is when I'm the judge, then it's my standards that dictate entrance. But when God's the judge, and it's his standards and how he views our sin, then it changes, because the way I view a lie is so different than the way God views a lie. Yep. And the way I view my selfishness is so different than how God views my selfishness. Yep. When you're talking about a person, and when we speak about God, who's not selfish, and then he looks at me who's being selfish, that doesn't come across the same way as another person who's next beside me who's just as selfish as I am, and so we don't think our selfishness is that selfish. Yeah. We're like, that's not that bad. Yeah. Man, I know somebody. I mean, why does a guy need $1 billion? I mean, that guy's selfish, right? But to God, he's like, no, you had 2 coats, and there was a person that was cold. Why didn't you just give him one? Yeah. You had extra food. Why didn't you just share it? Yeah. Like, what are you doing? Like, it's to him, it's like, it's crazy that we would be that way
Yeah.
in that sense. So I think that goes along to, but then we have to actually, again, trust the judge and also understand how we are trying to judge the matter. And that's a difficult thing to come to, but when you can, there's actually freedom there.
Huge.
Because then you know that, like, and that's the one thing. It's one thing about Christianity, and this isn't part of the topic, but I mean, it's a faith that means everybody is the same. Yeah. You are treated the same by God. It's not based on race. It's not based on gender. It's not based on. He's going to treat you the same, and you can guarantee at the top of that list is love.
Yep.
And that's something that just speaks.
Yeah. You matter.
Every person in humanity wants that treatment.
Yeah.
And I think getting there and remembering that, I think, is important.
Yeah. I definitely think we've talked about this before, but the awareness of your own sin is so crucial for a Christian, because it puts you at a humble level, right? It's that unmerciful servant, parable of unmerciful servant, where he's forgiven a ton, and then he goes out and believes he can judge others. And the judge is like, what are you doing? I forgave you 100,000 and you're going to throw somebody in prison over $100? What are we doing here? But it's that same thing.
Yeah.
And so when we remember that how much we've been forgiven, I think that really sets us up well to enjoy relationship and enjoy our relationship with God. So, thanks for the question. Our time is up. Thank you so much for being with us. Our thoughts and prayers for you guys as a church family throughout the weeks constantly. We are excited for when you guys do come back. This place is going to look different. Man, have they been working here. And so we're excited to show that, excited to see what God is going to do here in the future. With that, I'm going to pray with you guys, and we'll jump into Psalm series. Father God, thank you so much for this morning, for our family. And I know that we are separated and we are not all in the same building the way we'd like. But God, thank you for this technology. Thank you for the way that you have knit our community together. Thank you for all those who are watching this morning who are not a part of our community, for those who are watching who may never have heard the gospel before. Father, I pray that they will get a sense of your love and your peace and your grace this morning. And then for all of us, God, give us the courage to take whatever next step you've called us to this morning. God, each one of us was here for a reason. We believe that. And so I just pray, God, that you will move in us, give us the courage to act, give us the courage to live out that love. Thank you, God, for being a good judge. Thank you, God, for your love. I pray all these things in your name.